You may not have noticed it all at once. There was no dramatic moment, no single event you could point to and say, that was it. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost politely, like a subtle shift in the air that made everything feel slightly unfamiliar. The world looks the same. The routines continue. People speak and move, as they always have. Yet something underneath it all has changed. You feel it in the pauses between thoughts, in the way silence carries more weight than before, in the strange sense that returning to how things were is no longer possible, even if nothing obvious has gone wrong. It is not loud enough to panic, not intense enough to explain to someone else, but it is undeniable. You can no longer pretend that everything is the same, because pretending now requires effort. This is how real transitions begin. Not with collapse, but with awareness. Not with chaos, but with a quiet knowing that something has shifted and will not shift back. What you are experiencing is not confusion, and it is not imagination. It is the first signal of movement beneath the surface of your life. This message did not appear in your awareness by accident, and it is not here to be consumed casually, skimmed, or forgotten. It is not passive information meant to entertain or distract you for a few moments. This moment is participatory. It requires your presence, not your belief. You did not find this message the way one finds random content while scrolling or searching. You aligned with it. Alignment does not happen because you are special, chosen, or superior. It happens because your internal state reached a point where this frequency could register without being dismissed. Thousands of messages pass through awareness every day, but only a few land. Only a few create that inner pause, that feeling of this is speaking to something in me. That pause is alignment. That is resonance. And resonance is not intellectual agreement. It is recognition at a level deeper than thought. Right now, a new timeline is already in motion. Not a future possibility. Not a hypothetical outcome, but an active trajectory that has begun reorganizing your internal world. Timelines do not announce themselves with fireworks. They reveal themselves through subtle friction, through restlessness that has no clear cause, through a quiet pressure that builds even when everything appears fine on the surface. You may feel uneasy without knowing why, dissatisfied without being able to name what is missing, or strangely alert, as if you are waiting for something you cannot describe. This unease is not failure. It is not a sign that you are doing something wrong or that you have lost your way. It is evidence of transition. It is the nervous system, the psyche, and the deeper layers of awareness adjusting to a shift in direction. When a timeline changes, the first thing to destabilize is comfort. Familiar patterns begin to feel restrictive. Old motivations lose their charge. Things that once soothed you no longer work the way they used to. This is not because you are broken, but because you are no longer compatible with what once sustained you. What seems to be falling apart right now is not breaking. It is releasing. There is an important difference between destruction and release, though they can feel similar when you are inside them. Breaking implies damage, loss, and irreversibility born of failure. Release implies completion. It means something has done its job and can no longer travel forward with you. Identities, habits, relationships, dreams, and even versions of yourself can reach a point where they simply cannot accompany the next phase of movement. They become heavy, inefficient, misaligned. When that happens, the system initiates separation, not to punish you, but to protect coherence. This is why holding on feels harder than letting go, even though letting go is frightening. You may notice resistance arising, not because the old structures are good for you, but because they are familiar. Familiarity has always been confused with safety, but they are not the same. Safety supports growth. Familiarity only repeats what is known. As this release unfolds, it can feel like things are slipping through your fingers before you have time to understand them. Plans dissolve, motivations shift. Conversations feel hollow, and the future feels undefined in a way that is both unsettling and oddly relieving. The mind wants explanations, timelines, reassurance. It wants to label the experience, to categorize it as a crisis, a breakdown, a mistake. But this moment does not belong to the mind alone. It belongs to awareness, Awareness does not rush to define. It observes. It notices patterns, loosening attachments, weakening inner space, expanding. This expansion is uncomfortable because it removes reference points. When reference points dissolve, identity feels threatened. Who am I if I'm no longer driven by what used to drive me? Who am I if the old goals no longer excite me? Who am I if I cannot return to the version of myself that fits so neatly into the old structure? These questions are not problems to be solved immediately. They are signs that you are standing between timelines no longer fully inside the old one, not yet fully embodied in the new. The pressure you feel is not pushing you toward collapse. It is inviting you toward participation. Up until now, much of life may have felt like something that happened to you. Choices were made within invisible constraints. Reactions followed familiar scripts, and patterns repeated even when you promised yourself they would not. Participation changes that dynamic. Participation means recognizing that awareness itself is active. You are not merely observing change. You are part of the mechanism through which change stabilizes. This does not mean forcing outcomes or controlling the process. It means staying present while the reorganization happens, resisting the urge to numb, distract, or retreat into old coping strategies that no longer fit. A new timeline does not require you to become someone else overnight. It requires honesty. It requires you to notice where your energy no longer flows, where your body tightens in response to familiar situations, where your intuition quietly says no, even when logic argues yes. These signals were always there, but now they are louder because ignoring them is no longer sustainable. The quiet pressure you feel is the pressure of alignment asserting itself. Alignment is not comfortable at first. It strips away excuses. It removes the buffer between what you know and how you live. That is why it can feel relentless. There is a sense that you are being asked to show up differently, even though no one has given you instructions. That sense is accurate. The instructions are internal, and they arrive as sensations, impulses, and shifts in perception rather than words. You may feel drawn to stillness or irritated by noise that never bothered you before. You may crave simplicity while simultaneously feeling overwhelmed by the unknown. This paradox is part of the transition. Simplicity clears space. Uncertainty invites expansion. Together, they prepare the ground for something that cannot emerge within the old configuration. It is important to understand that nothing is wrong because you feel unsettled. In fact, if nothing felt unsettled, that would be the real warning sign. Comfort during a timeline shift usually indicates avoidance, not stability. Growth that actually changes trajectory is disruptive by nature, not because it destroys what matters, but because it refuses to preserve what no longer aligns. Preservation is not always virtuous. Sometimes it is fear disguised as loyalty. Sometimes it is habit masquerading as commitment. The release you are experiencing is not asking you to abandon everything. It is asking you to stop carrying what was never meant to be permanent. You do not need to rush this process, and you do not need to understand it fully to participate. Participation begins with acknowledgement, acknowledging that something has changed, acknowledging that you feel it, acknowledging that the old explanations no longer satisfy. From there, presence does the rest. The new timeline does not require force. It requires coherence. Coherence emerges when your actions, perceptions, and inner truth begin to align naturally without constant negotiation. That alignment starts now, not later, not after clarity arrives, but in this very moment of uncertainty. You are not waiting for the shift. You are inside it. And what feels like the quiet unraveling of the familiar is actually the precise release that makes forward movement possible. Resonance is the real mechanism behind awakening, not destiny, not selection, not hierarchy, and not the idea that some people are more special or more worthy than others. Awakening does not arrive because you were chosen from above or elevated above those around you. It arrives because something inside you reached a state where it could finally register what had always been present. Resonance is not a reward. It is a condition. It is what happens when an internal system becomes compatible with a certain frequency of information, perception, or truth. Until that compatibility exists, the same message can pass by unnoticed, dismissed, or distorted into something unrecognizable. This is why two people can hear the same words and have entirely different reactions. One feels nothing. The other feels as if something deep inside has been touched. That difference has nothing to do with intelligence, education, morality, or effort. It has everything to do with readiness. Readiness is often misunderstood as preparation in the conscious sense, as if one studies enough, heals enough, or believes strongly enough, and then earns access to awakening. But readiness does not work like that. It is not a badge you receive for good behavior or spiritual discipline. It is a state of the nervous system, an energetic configuration shaped by lived experience, accumulated stress, survival patterns, loss insight, and moments of quiet integration. Your system becomes ready when it can receive new information without immediately defending against it, romanticizing it, or collapsing under its weight. Before that point, the same truth would either be rejected or turned into fantasy. This is why awakening cannot be forced. You cannot think your way into resonance. You cannot will your nervous system to be stable enough to hold a wider awareness. That stability is built indirectly, often through experiences that feel unrelated to anything spiritual at the time. Disappointment, repetition, exhaustion, grief, disillusionment, boredom, and even failure all play a role in shaping readiness. They wear down the false structures that once filtered perception. They exhaust the coping mechanisms that kept life predictable but small. Over time, the system learns that its old strategies no longer work. And in that learning, a certain openness appears. Not optimism, not hope, but openness. Resonance requires that openness. When people say they weren't ready, before they often mean that their internal system was still invested in familiar explanations. Familiar explanations protect identity. They preserve roles, beliefs, and expectations that make life feel manageable. Awakening disrupts that manageability. It introduces ambiguity, responsibility, and presence in places where autopilot once operated. A system that is still dependent on certainty validation or external structure cannot resonate with that disruption. It will either reject it or distort it into something safe like ideology or fantasy. This is why readiness is not intellectual. You can understand every concept and still not resonate. You can read books, listen to teachings, memorize frameworks, and still remain untouched. Resonance is felt, not understood. It shows up as a bodily response before it becomes a thought. A pause in breathing, a tightening or release in the chest, a sudden stillness, a sense of this matters without knowing why. These reactions occur because the nervous system recognizes coherence. Coherence is when information aligns with the system's current capacity rather than overwhelming it. When coherence is absent, the system reacts defensively. It becomes skeptical, dismissive, euphoric, or obsessed. All of those are signs of distortion. Readiness means the system can stay present without clinging or resisting. Energetically, readiness is about bandwidth. Every system has a limited capacity for intensity, novelty, and uncertainty. When that capacity is low, anything that threatens the familiar feels dangerous. When capacity expands, the same stimulus feels interesting rather than threatening. This expansion does not happen through positive thinking. It happens through regulation. Regulation is the nervous system's ability to return to baseline after activation. Over time, as regulation improves, the system becomes less reactive. Less reactive systems can hold more truth without fragmentation. This is why awakening often follows periods of instability that eventually settle into a strange calm. The calm is not apathy, it is capacity. Experientially readiness comes from having lived through enough repetition that unconscious patterns become visible. At first, life feels like a series of isolated events. Later patterns emerge. The same relationships, the same conflicts, the same internal struggles appear in different forms. At some point, the system stops asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and starts sensing that something is being repeated. That sensing is the beginning of awareness. Awareness does not immediately change behavior. It changes orientation. Instead of being lost inside the pattern, you begin to notice it. That noticing creates distance. Distance creates choice. But choice only becomes real when awareness is stable enough to stay present without reverting to old reflexes. This is where resonance becomes crucial. When a message, experience, or realization arrives at the moment that awareness is stable, it lands cleanly. It does not need to be defended against or exaggerated. It integrates. Integration is what distinguishes awakening from spiritual bypass or temporary insight. Many people have glimpses, few integrate. Integration happens when the nervous system does not treat insight as a threat or an escape. It treats it as information that can be lived with. This moment marks the crossing from unconscious repetition into conscious participation. Unconscious repetition is not ignorance. It is automation. It is living from conditioned responses without seeing them as conditioned. In unconscious repetition, you may feel as if you are making choices, but those choices are largely predictable. They follow emotional grooves carved by past experience. Conscious participation does not mean controlling every outcome. It means recognizing your role in the pattern. It means seeing how perception, reaction, and interpretation shape experience. This shift is subtle, but profound. Suddenly, life is no longer something that simply happens. It becomes something you are in relationship with. You notice how your attention changes what you experience. You notice how certain reactions no longer make sense, even if they still arise. You notice that you cannot fully blame circumstances or people anymore, not because they are innocent, but because your awareness has expanded to include your own participation. This can feel unsettling. Many people unconsciously prefer unconscious repetition because it preserves innocence. If everything is happening to you, you are not responsible for how you meet it. Conscious participation removes that buffer. It does not demand perfection, but it does demand honesty. Resonance is what allows that honesty to feel possible rather than crushing. Without resonance, responsibility feels like blame. With resonance, responsibility feels like agency. The same awareness that once would have overwhelmed you now feels grounding. That is readiness. This is why awakening does not spread evenly or predictably. It appears sporadic, personal, even random from the outside. But it is not random. It follows internal thresholds. When those thresholds are crossed, resonance becomes inevitable. You start noticing what you could not notice before, not because the world changed, but because your system did. You may look back and realize that messages, experiences, or truths were always around you. They just did not register. Or they registered as something else entirely. This is not failure, it is timing. Timing is not external. It is physiological and energetic. This moment you're in now is not a beginning in the dramatic sense. It is a transition point. You are not suddenly awakened. You are becoming unable to remain unconscious in the same way. The old level of automation no longer works. The old explanations no longer satisfy. The old distractions no longer fully distract. That is resonance asserting itself. It is not asking you to become someone new. It is asking you to stop pretending you are not already involved. Conscious participation does not require certainty. It requires presence. It requires staying with experience instead of escaping into narratives. It requires noticing how your system responds and learning from that response rather than judging it. Awakening in this sense is not an achievement. It is a reorientation from sleepwalking to walking awake. Resonance is simply the mechanism that makes that reorientation possible. Without it, the door remains invisible. With it, the door does not need to be opened. You realize you have been standing in the doorway all along, repeating patterns unconsciously. This moment is when repetition becomes visible, and visibility changes everything. There is a clear but often overlooked difference between consuming information and becoming aware, and that difference has nothing to do with intelligence education or how much content you have absorbed. Consuming information is passive even when it feels engaging. It can be emotional, inspiring, reassuring, or intellectually stimulating, yet still leave the deeper structure of perception untouched. Becoming aware, on the other hand, is active in a way that cannot be delegated or outsourced. It requires presence, and presence is uncomfortable because it removes distance. Passive listening almost always seeks something specific, even if unconsciously. It seeks comfort, validation, confirmation, or escape. Comfort means the information reassures you that things are fine or will be fine without requiring change. Validation means it confirms what you already believe about yourself, your pain, your identity, or your role in the world. Escape means it temporarily lifts you out of discomfort without addressing its source. None of these are inherently wrong. They serve a purpose, especially when the nervous system is overwhelmed or depleted. But they do not lead to awareness. They lead to soothing. Awareness does not soothe at first. Awareness destabilizes. That is why the mind often prefers consumption over awareness, even when it claims to want growth. Consumption allows you to stay slightly removed. You are listening to ideas, stories, or insights as if they exist outside of you. You can agree, disagree, feel moved, feel inspired, and then return to your life unchanged. The observer remains at a safe distance. Awareness collapses that distance. When awareness arises, you are no longer watching life as if it is happening somewhere else. You begin to notice how you are involved in what you experience. This is the moment where perception itself becomes visible. You start to see that reality is not just what happens, but how it is interpreted, filtered, and responded to through your internal system. This is a radical shift, not because it adds information, but because it removes the illusion of separation. Passive listening treats information as something you receive. Awareness reveals that experience is something you participate in. This is why awareness demands presence. Presence means being here with what is actually happening in your body, emotions, thoughts, and reactions without immediately trying to change them, explain them, or escape them. Presence removes the buffer of distraction. When you are present, you notice subtleties that passive listening overlooks. You notice how certain words create tension in your chest, how certain ideas feel relieving, how certain truths provoke resistance or fear. These reactions are not intellectual. They are physiological. They reveal how your system organizes reality. Passive listening rarely engages this level because it allows you to float above your reactions. You can say that's interesting or that resonates without staying long enough to feel what it actually stirs. Awareness stays. It does not rush to conclusion. It notices that resonance is not just agreement, but a felt alignment that may require change. This is why awareness feels heavier than information. Information can be consumed quickly. Awareness unfolds slowly because it involves integration. Integration means that what you notice begins to influence how you live, not just how you think. This is where responsibility enters. Responsibility in this context does not mean blame or obligation. It means responsibility, the capacity to respond rather than react. When you are passively consuming, your reactions feel automatic and justified. Something happens, you feel something, you act or withdraw, and it feels inevitable. Awareness interrupts that inevitability. It shows you the space between stimulus and response. In that space, choice becomes visible. Choice is what makes the observer responsible. Not responsible for everything that happens, but responsible for how perception shapes experience. This responsibility can feel unsettling because it removes the comfort of unconsciousness. Unconscious repetition allows you to say, "This is just how I am," or "This always happens to me," without questioning the underlying pattern. Awareness exposes the pattern. Once exposed, it cannot be unseen. This is why many people unconsciously resist awareness while consciously seeking insight. Insight can be admired from a distance. Awareness demands embodiment. It asks you to notice how your attention amplifies certain aspects of reality and ignores others. It asks you to see how your expectations shape what you perceive, how your fears narrow your field of vision, how your desires color interpretation. This does not mean that reality is imaginary or purely subjective. It means that your experience of reality is co-created through perception. Passive listening keeps perception invisible. Awareness brings it to the foreground. When perception becomes visible, the observer can no longer claim neutrality. You begin to see how you contribute to the tone, direction, and meaning of your experiences. This is the point where life stops feeling like a movie you are watching and starts feeling like something you are inside of. That shift is subtle but profound. It often arrives as discomfort because it disrupts familiar narratives. You may notice that explanations you once relied on no longer fully satisfy. You may feel less certain, less defended, more exposed. This exposure is not vulnerability in the emotional sense alone. It is perceptual vulnerability. You are seeing more, and seeing more means you cannot hide behind simplified stories. Passive listening thrives on clear categories: right and wrong, awakened and asleep, victim and perpetrator, healed and broken. Awareness complicates these categories. It shows you how quickly roles shift depending on context, how easily the mind creates coherence by omitting inconvenient details. This complexity can feel destabilizing, but it is also liberating. It frees you from rigid identities. Awareness does not tell you who to be. It shows you how you are being. That difference matters. When you are consuming information, identity often strengthens. You adopt labels, frameworks, and narratives that help you understand yourself. When you are becoming aware, identity softens. You see identity as a pattern rather than a fixed truth. This softening can feel like loss at first. Who am I if I am not my story, my wounds, my beliefs, my goals? Awareness does not answer that question directly. It allows it to remain open. This openness is what enables growth that is not forced. Responsibility arises naturally from this openness. When you see how your attention, interpretation, and reaction shape experience, you begin to act with more precision. Not perfection, but precision. You notice when you are projecting, when you are avoiding, when you are repeating. This noticing does not automatically stop the behavior, but it changes your relationship to it. You are no longer fully identified with it. That separation creates room for choice. Choice is the hallmark of conscious participation. Conscious participation does not mean controlling outcomes or managing reality. It means engaging with life from awareness rather than habit. It means responding to what is actually happening rather than what you expect or fear will happen. This shift is irreversible once it stabilizes, because you cannot unknow what you now see. Passive listening can always be returned to. Awareness, once embodied, changes the baseline. You may still consume information, seek comfort, or escape at times, but you will notice when you are doing it. That noticing is the difference. It prevents complete dissociation. It keeps a thread of presence alive, even in moments of distraction. This is why awareness feels like responsibility. Not because you must do everything right, but because you are now aware of your participation. You can no longer fully blame the world for your inner state, nor can you fully deny the impact of circumstances. You hold both. That holding requires maturity. Maturity here does not mean seriousness or heaviness. It means the capacity to stay with complexity without collapsing into certainty or avoidance. This is the line being drawn right now. On one side is consumption information that soothes, validates, or entertains without demanding presence. On the other side is awareness, perception, turning inward, noticing itself, and reshaping how you engage with reality. Crossing this line does not make you better than anyone else. It makes you more involved. You are no longer standing at a distance, commenting on life. You are inside the process, aware that how you see shapes what you experience. That is the moment the observer becomes responsible. Not burdened, not guilty, but awake enough to participate consciously. Growth is often imagined as something slow, steady, and predictable. Step by step, layer by layer, effort, followed by reward, cause followed by effect. This model of gradual linear growth is deeply embedded in how the mind understands change. It feels safe because it is measurable. You can track progress, compare yesterday to today, and reassure yourself that movement is happening, even if it is subtle. Linear growth operates within an existing framework. The structure of identity, belief, perception, and behavior remains largely intact while improvements are made inside it. Skills are refined, habits are adjusted, wounds are managed, goals are pursued in a way that feels continuous with the past. This kind of growth is real, necessary, and valuable. It builds capacity over time. It teaches patience, discipline, and consistency. But it is not the only way transformation occurs, and it is not the kind of change you are encountering now. Quantum shifts follow a completely different logic. They do not accumulate in neat increments. They do not reward effort in proportion to time invested. They do not respect timelines the mind can anticipate. Instead, they arrive through collapse and reorganization. Something fundamental gives way, not because it failed, but because it reached the limit of its usefulness. When that happens, the system does not slowly adjust. It restructures. The difference between these two modes of change is not a matter of speed alone. It is a matter of depth. Gradual growth modifies content. Quantum change alters structure. In gradual growth, the same underlying assumptions remain in place. You still relate to yourself, others, and reality through familiar lenses, just with more awareness or skill. In quantum change, the lenses themselves shift. What once framed experience no longer does. This is why the transition feels disorienting. The mind keeps looking for evidence of progress using old metrics, but those metrics no longer apply. You may feel as if you have regressed, stalled, or lost momentum, when in reality the system is undergoing a reconfiguration that cannot be measured by linear standards. Collapse is a frightening word, but in this context, it does not mean destruction. It means the dissolution of structures that can no longer support the next level of organization. In nature, collapse is often a prerequisite for emergence. A caterpillar does not gradually turn into a butterfly by improving its caterpillar traits. Its structure dissolves almost entirely inside the chrysalis before reorganizing into something fundamentally different. From the outside, it appears as stillness or breakdown. From the inside, it is radical transformation. Human systems undergo similar processes, though they are less visible and more psychologically complex. When a quantum shift begins, the old framework starts to feel unstable. Beliefs that once guided you no longer feel convincing. Motivations that once drove you lose their force. Roles you once inhabited with ease begin to feel restrictive or false. This instability can be mistaken for failure if you expect growth to look like steady improvement. But improvement within a structure is not possible when the structure itself has become the limitation. This is why this transition is not incremental. You are not being asked to tweak habits, refine goals, or optimize your life within the same paradigm. You are being asked to let the paradigm itself change. Structural change happens quickly, once the conditions are met, not because it is rushed, but because the groundwork was laid invisibly over time. Quantum shifts often feel sudden, but they are rarely unprepared. Years of gradual accumulation often precede them. Experiences stack insights, gather tensions, build contradictions, multiply. At some point, the system reaches a threshold where it can no longer maintain coherence in its current form. That is when collapse occurs. The collapse may look like burnout, loss of interest, emotional upheaval, identity, confusion, or a sense that everything familiar has gone quiet. What is actually happening is that the old framework is releasing its grip. Once that grip loosens, reorganization can happen rapidly. This is why what once took years to evolve now changes in moments. The effort is not in the change itself. It was in the preparation. When the underlying framework shifts, Many secondary patterns realign automatically. Behaviors change without force. Priorities reorder themselves. Boundaries become clearer. Decisions that once felt agonizing suddenly feel obvious. This can be startling, especially if you are used to working hard for every inch of progress. The mind may try to reassert control, questioning whether the change is real, whether it is too fast, whether it can be trusted. But speed here is not recklessness, it is efficiency. When a structure changes, the system no longer has to negotiate with outdated assumptions. It moves according to a new internal logic. This is why quantum change often feels irreversible. It is not that you cannot physically return to old behaviors. It is that doing so feels incoherent. The old framework no longer fits the way perception now operates. Gradual growth allows for backsliding because the core structure remains familiar. Quantum shifts remove that familiarity. You cannot unsee what you now see. You cannot unknow what your system has reorganized around. This does not mean life becomes easy. Structural change brings its own challenges, but those challenges are different. They are not about becoming better within old constraints. They are about learning how to live from a new baseline. This is why trying to apply linear expectations to a quantum transition creates suffering. If you expect steady progress, you will interpret pauses as stagnation. If you expect gradual improvement, you will interpret collapse as failure. If you expect clarity to arrive slowly, you will distrust sudden insight. The key is to recognize which mode of change you are in. Right now, you are not in a phase of accumulation. You are in a phase of reorganization. The work is not to push forward, but to allow the restructuring to complete. That allowance requires patience of a different kind. Not patience for slow progress, but patience for uncertainty. The mind wants to know what comes next, how long it will take, and what the outcome will be. Quantum change does not offer those answers up front. It offers coherence instead. As the new framework stabilizes, coherence increases. Things begin to make sense in a different way. Not because you have explanations for everything, but because your actions, perceptions, and inner state align more naturally. This alignment reduces friction. You spend less energy forcing yourself to fit into situations that no longer match your structure. You stop negotiating with parts of yourself that are no longer in charge. This can feel like relief, even when the external circumstances are still uncertain. It is important to understand that quantum change does not invalidate gradual growth. The two are not enemies. They operate at different levels. Gradual growth builds capacity within a structure. Quantum shifts change the structure itself. Often, years of gradual growth are what make a quantum shift possible. Skills learned, boundaries, practiced awareness, cultivated all contribute to the system's ability to survive collapse without fragmenting. Without that preparation, collapse would feel like chaos rather than transformation. This is why some people experience breakdowns that do not reorganize into breakthroughs. The system collapses, but there is not enough coherence to rebuild in a new way. In your case, the reorganization is happening because the capacity is there. The underlying framework is shifting because it can. This is also why comparison becomes meaningless during quantum change. You cannot measure your progress against someone else's timeline because timelines no longer operate the same way. You cannot even measure your progress against your past self because the criteria have changed. What mattered before may no longer matter. What seemed insignificant may now feel central. This inversion is a hallmark of structural change. Values reorder themselves. Attention follows different signals. Energy flows toward different expressions. Trying to force the old hierarchy of importance onto the new structure creates tension. Letting the new structure reveal itself creates ease. Ease does not mean comfort. It means reduced internal conflict. You may still face difficult choices, but they are clearer. You may still experience loss, but it feels purposeful rather than random. You may still feel fear, but it no longer paralyzes in the same way. This is because the system is operating from a different center. The underlying framework has shifted from survival-based repetition to coherence-based participation. In survival mode, gradual improvement feels necessary because stability depends on control. In coherence mode, structural change feels natural because stability comes from alignment. This is the deeper reason why change accelerates. When alignment replaces control, the system no longer resists its own movement. Resistance is what slows change. When resistance drops, transformation appears sudden. It is not that reality sped up. It is that friction decreased. This is the context in which moments can carry the weight of years. A single realization can dissolve patterns that took decades to form. A single decision can redirect a life trajectory without the need for endless preparation. These moments are not magical. They are structural. They occur because the system has crossed a threshold where the old framework no longer governs behavior. From this point on, growth will not look like it used to. You may still learn, practice, and refine, but it will happen within a new architecture. That architecture is still stabilizing. The sensations of disorientation, intensity, or rapid insight are signs that the reorganization is underway. Trust does not mean blind faith. It means recognizing the logic of the process you are in. Linear strategies will feel ineffective here, not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are trying to apply tools designed for accumulation to a phase defined by transformation. This transition is not asking you to try harder. It is asking you to allow the structure to finish changing. Once it does, movement will feel natural again, but it will be movement from a different foundation. What once took years will no longer require the same effort because the effort was never the point. The framework was, and that framework has shifted. At any given moment, a human life exists inside a field of potential futures. These futures are not fantasies or choices in the abstract sense. They are trajectories shaped by perception, nervous system patterns, beliefs, unresolved memory, and the level of awareness available to the system at that time. Most of the time, these futures coexist quietly. You wake up, repeat familiar routines, make small decisions, and the range of possible outcomes remains wide because your perception has not fundamentally changed. The system continues to operate within a known bandwidth. From inside this state, life feels open-ended. You believe you could become many versions of yourself, return to old versions, or pause indefinitely without consequence. This sense of optionality is not freedom, it is latency. It exists because awareness has not yet reached a threshold that forces coherence. When awareness expands, the field of potential futures begins to reorganize. Futures that once seemed viable start to lose energetic support. They do not disappear immediately. They fade. They feel heavier to imagine, harder to sustain emotionally, less convincing when you try to picture yourself living them. At first, this can be subtle. You may notice a vague disinterest in paths you once considered normal. You may feel an inexplicable resistance to returning to certain habits, relationships, or ambitions, even when nothing external is preventing you. This is the early stage of collapse. The system is beginning to recognize that not all futures are compatible with the level of awareness now online. As awareness increases, coherence becomes the governing principle. Coherence is the degree to which perception, action, and internal truth align without friction. A future that requires you to shrink your perception, numb your sensitivity, or override your knowing becomes incoherent. You can still imagine it intellectually, but your body rejects it. Your nervous system signals that something is off. This is not preference. It is structural incompatibility. When enough of these incompatibilities accumulate, the system can no longer sustain multiple trajectories. The collapse happens not because options are taken away, but because maintaining incoherent options becomes energetically impossible. This is why the change feels sudden. From the outside, it looks like a decision or a turning point. From the inside, it feels like inevitability. The system reaches a point where only one trajectory can carry the full weight of awareness without distortion. At that moment, the field collapses. The other futures do not vanish in theory, but they become inaccessible in practice. You cannot step into them without fragmenting yourself. Going back would require unseeing what you have seen, unfeeling what you now feel, compressing awareness into a smaller container. The system resists this not out of moral judgment, but out of self-preservation. Expanded awareness cannot comfortably inhabit a contracted timeline. This is why returning feels impossible. Not forbidden, impossible. The old timeline was built to support a narrower range of perception. It relied on certain blind spots, certain tolerances for dissonance, certain habits of distraction or justification. Once those supports are gone, the structure cannot hold. You might still physically revisit old environments or behaviors, but they feel hollow, strained, or strangely unreal. The coherence that once animated them is absent. This creates the sensation of irreversibility. It is not that you are trapped on a path. It is that the path you are on is the only one that remains internally consistent with who you are now. This consistency is what gives the new trajectory its force. It pulls rather than pushes. Decisions begin to make themselves because alternatives no longer register as real options. This can be unsettling because the mind equates freedom with choice. When choice narrows the mind, fear is loss. But what is actually happening is refinement. Freedom at this level is not about having many paths. It is about being fully aligned with the one that matches your awareness. The collapse of potential futures often coincides with a sense of urgency or intensity. Time feels different. Moments carry more weight. This is because the system is no longer distributing energy across multiple hypothetical directions. Energy consolidates. Attention sharpens. Actions feel consequential. This consolidation is what gives quantum transitions their momentum. Once the trajectory locks in, movement accelerates because there is no longer internal debate. The nervous system stops oscillating between incompatible signals. This does not mean the path is easy. It means it is clear. Clarity can feel harsh at first because it removes the comfort of ambiguity. You can no longer tell yourself that you will figure it out later while continuing as before. The expanded awareness demands congruence now. This demand is not external pressure. It is internal alignment asserting itself. The old timeline often feels safer in retrospect because it allowed delay. You could postpone truth-numbed discomfort, rationalize misalignment. The new trajectory does not allow that without immediate feedback. Discomfort arises quickly when you drift. Fatigue sets in faster when you betray your knowing. This is not punishment. It is sensitivity. As awareness expands, the margin for incoherence shrinks. This is another reason going back feels impossible. The system has become too sensitive to tolerate what it once endured. People sometimes interpret this as fragility, but it is actually precision. A finely tuned instrument cannot function in the same environment as a blunt one. The environment is not wrong. It is simply incompatible. This applies to timelines as well. The old timeline was built for a less precise instrument. The new awareness requires a different context, different rhythms, different forms of engagement. When potential futures collapse, identity often destabilizes. You may feel unmoored, as if the story of who you were no longer applies, but the story of who you are becoming is not yet fully formed. This liminal state can be mistaken for loss or confusion. In reality, it is the transitional space where the new trajectory is stabilizing. The collapse has occurred, but the reorganization is still unfolding. During this phase, the mind may attempt to resurrect old options out of fear. It may replay familiar narratives, tempt you with nostalgia, or suggest that you overreacted. These attempts fail not because you resist them, but because they no longer generate coherence. They feel like echoes rather than invitations. This is how you know the collapse is real. If an option truly remained viable, it would carry energy. It would feel alive. The absence of that aliveness is the signal. Only one path continues to respond, to engage your attention, to feel charged, even when it is difficult. That charge is not excitement. It is resonance. Resonance is the alignment between awareness and trajectory. When they match, movement happens naturally, even through uncertainty. This is why the new path feels both unsettling and undeniable. You may not like every aspect of it. You may grieve what fell away. but you cannot genuinely choose otherwise. Choice has transformed into recognition. You recognize yourself in this trajectory in a way that bypasses preference. This recognition is what makes the change irreversible. Awareness has expanded beyond the capacity of the old timeline to contain it. Once awareness crosses that threshold, the system reorganizes around a new center of gravity. Everything begins to orient around that center. Relationships, work, values, even the sense of time itself adjust. This does not happen because you decide it should. It happens because coherence demands it. The idea that multiple futures collapse into one can sound deterministic, but it is not fate in the traditional sense. It is the natural consequence of alignment. As long as awareness remains diffuse, many futures can coexist. As awareness concentrates, only those futures that can support that concentration remain accessible. The rest fall away, not as punishment, but as completion. They were paths for who you were. This is the path for who you are now. And once the system recognizes that difference, it cannot convincingly pretend otherwise. Restlessness and discomfort are usually treated as symptoms to be eliminated. From an early age, the system is trained to interpret agitation as something gone wrong. Anxiety means danger. Discomfort means failure. Unease means you should fix, distract, numb, or return to what is familiar. This interpretation only makes sense inside a stable operating system, where the goal is to maintain equilibrium and preserve existing structures. But when the system itself is changing, the meaning of these sensations shifts completely. What you are experiencing is not malfunction. It is signal. It is feedback from a system in transition, indicating that old patterns no longer fit the current level of awareness. The restlessness is not random energy. It has direction. It exists because the system is actively preventing you from settling back into configurations that can no longer support who you are becoming. In a stable operating system, coping mechanisms work because they are aligned with the system's architecture. Distraction soothes routines, regulate familiar narratives, restore a sense of control. But when an upgrade begins, those same mechanisms lose their effectiveness. You may try to relax the way you used to and find that it no longer works. You may reach for comfort and feel strangely unsatisfied, even irritated by the attempt. This is not because you are doing it wrong. It is because those mechanisms belong to a previous version of the system. They were designed to stabilize an older configuration of awareness. The upgrade changes the architecture itself, and tools built for the old structure cannot interface properly with the new one. The discomfort you feel is the friction between incompatible systems. The nervous system is recalibrating to operate with more data, more sensitivity, more range. During this recalibration, signals amplify. Sensations that were once background noise move to the foreground. Restlessness arises because the system is no longer allowed to go dormant in the same way. Dormancy in this context means unconscious repetition. Old patterns relied on partial numbness, selective attention, and predictable loops. The upgrade removes access to those shortcuts. Agitation is the safeguard. It keeps awareness online. It interrupts the impulse to regress. This is why the discomfort has a particular quality. It is not panic without cause. It is not despair. It is a low-grade, persistent pressure that says without words, this no longer works. That pressure is intelligent. It is not trying to harm you. It is trying to stop you from going backward into configurations that would require you to shrink awareness, dull perception, or override inner signals. In this sense, restlessness is protective. It prevents false stability. The system understands that returning to unconscious patterns would be more damaging than enduring temporary discomfort. From the outside, it may look like you are struggling to relax, commit, or settle. From the inside, what is happening is vigilance. Awareness is holding itself open, while the new operating parameters are being installed. This vigilance can feel exhausting because it is unfamiliar. The old system conserved energy by automating large portions of life. The new system requires conscious participation. Until new forms of regulation are established, the system stays alert. This alertness is often misinterpreted as anxiety, but anxiety implies fear of something specific. What you are experiencing is orientation without a fixed map. The system is scanning for coherence. It is learning what aligns and what does not under the new configuration. During this phase, the inability to be soothed by old comforts can feel cruel. You may wonder why nothing takes the edge off anymore, why pleasure feels muted, why distractions irritate rather than relax you. This happens because those comforts once functioned as exits from awareness. They lowered signal strength. In an upgraded system, lowering signal strength creates instability. The agitation you feel when you try to escape is the system rejecting a downgrade. It is saying in effect that unconsciousness is no longer a viable resting state. Rest must now occur with awareness intact. That is a profound shift, and it takes time to integrate. The agitation exists not to torment you, but to enforce the transition. If the system allowed you to fully relax into old patterns, the upgrade would stall. Awareness would fragment. The old operating system would reassert itself by default. Restlessness keeps the process moving forward. It applies just enough pressure to prevent settling into incoherence. This is why the discomfort often intensifies when you attempt to go back to who you were. The system responds immediately with unease, heaviness, or irritability. It is not punishing you. It is signaling incompatibility. Over time, as the new operating system stabilizes restlessness, changes character, it becomes less frantic and more directional. Instead of a vague agitation, it turns into a clear sense of misalignment when something is off and a quiet ease when something is right. But during the upgrade phase, the signals are coarse. Everything feels loud because the system is still learning how to differentiate. This learning requires exposure. It requires you to stay present with the sensations rather than suppress them. Suppression would only prolong the process by forcing the system to maintain incompatible layers. It is important to understand that restlessness is not asking you to act impulsively. It is not telling you to burn everything down or chase stimulation. It is asking you not to anesthetize yourself. The agitation keeps you awake to what is happening. It ensures that awareness does not collapse back into habit. This is why the discomfort often peaks in moments of stillness. When external distractions drop away, the system has space to surface signals that were previously drowned out. That surfacing can feel overwhelming if you expect stillness to equal calm. In this phase, stillness equals data. The body and nervous system are communicating what no longer fits, what needs to reorganize, what requires attention. Treating these signals as problems to be fixed creates resistance. Resistance amplifies discomfort because it pits the mind against the process. Treating them as signals changes the relationship. Instead of asking, "How do I make this stop?" the question becomes, "What is this preventing me from returning to?" Often the answer is unconsciousness. Old coping mechanisms worked by narrowing awareness. They numbed complexity. The upgrade expands capacity instead. Expansion initially feels like overload because the system has not yet optimized how to process the increased input. That optimization comes later. For now, the system prioritizes not losing awareness. This is why regression feels impossible. Even if you try to distract yourself, the relief is shallow and temporary. The signal returns quickly. The system is enforcing a new baseline. This baseline includes discomfort as a transitional feature, not a permanent state. Once the upgrade completes, new forms of regulation emerge. These forms do not rely on avoidance. They rely on alignment. Calm comes not from escaping sensation, but from moving in ways that match the new configuration. Until then, the agitation does its job. It keeps you from mistaking sedation for peace. It ensures that the old operating system cannot quietly reinstall itself while you are not paying attention. The restlessness is the firewall. The discomfort is the installer running in the background. It may slow things down, It may make the system feel unstable for a time, but it is precise. It activates exactly where old patterns would otherwise reassert control. If you listen carefully, you will notice that the agitation has boundaries. It intensifies around specific behaviors, environments, or thought patterns. It eases even briefly when you move in alignment with what the new system requires. These fluctuations are feedback. They are teaching the system how to operate at a higher resolution. Nothing is broken. Nothing has gone wrong. The discomfort is evidence that the upgrade is active and irreversible. It exists to ensure that awareness does not shrink to fit the past. It exists to make regression uncomfortable enough that forward movement, even when uncertain, becomes the only coherent option.